pleasure to introduce Gregor Gimmy as captain of the 27 pilots endeavor and the visionary behind the venture client model. Gregor focuses on advancing venture client knowledge and is deeply engaged in researching, publishing, and lecturing on the venture client model through leading business schools and top business engagements. Gregor is also a frequent speaker at startup-relevant conferences such as Slush, Web Summit, 4YFN, and DLD, but most importantly, Global Corporate Venturing. Gregor, welcome.
Thank you very much. Wow. Well, good morning to everybody. Excited to be able to travel again, and I just experienced this morning that traveling, you don't do this for 2 years, you lose practice. So, but here I am, I just made it in time, and I'm very grateful to the conference, James, whom I spoke at the beginning of the year, and I said, how about talking about a new venturing tool that I guess by accident, in a way, created at a car company, at BMW in 2014. And I'm extremely pleased that I have 2 other corporations here joining me today, which is Bosch, Philipp from Managing Director from Robert Bosch Venture Capital, which is, let's say, the organization unit that houses the venture client unit for Bosch, called Open Bosch. I also have with me here today Aziz, Sulaiman from Siemens Energy, who's principal of Siemens Energy Ventures. He's the person leading the venture client unit at Siemens Energy. So I would like to start with just a few words about my company. So in 2018, I quit BMW, set up 27 pilots, and 27 pilots is helping other corporations build and establish venture client or in-house venture client competencies. And we do this with a suite of venture client solutions, how we call this. And currently we have applied this and at various large corporations. 2 of them will be here with me today. And you learn a little bit now from me what venture clienting is or what the model entails. I won't be able to go into a huge detail, but maybe most importantly, in 2014, while I was working at BMW, nobody had told me at BMW, you got to deal with startups, so you have to do something with startups. But my background is from Silicon Valley. I lived many years in Silicon Valley. And while I was at BMW, I asked myself this question, how can all BMW measurably benefit from many top startups every year? And now the emphasis here is on all. So I was wondering, where are all the startups for manufacturing, logistics, IT, HR, beyond the car or beyond new business models for mobility? And if you want to benefit from startups across the value chain, you have to go beyond 5 or 10 per year. We talk about dozens, if not hundreds, of startups that are, that you should engage with, because their technologies, as we just heard before, they bear, a piece of competitive advantage that allows you to reduce cost or increase revenue faster. So how do we achieve that? Many startups every year at low risk, fast across the entire company. So I looked at that time, 2014, at the existing models. And the model on top, you're the experts, corporate venture capital, and you also heard about corporate accelerators on the bottom. Now what you can see here is that in corporate venture capital, the primary transaction is the purchase of a piece of equity. But in order to gain the strategic benefit, you also have to make a transfer of the technology. Right? So you have to basically bring the startup product into the corporation as fast as possible. So that was really my thinking. My thinking was, in order to increase the scale, the number speed and efficiency of benefiting from startups, what we have to do is we have to set up something that's independent from investment, with synergies to investment, but in the first stage, independent from investment, and that will help us gain access to more startups, and also all those startups you may not even want to invest in, or, truth be said, not every startup wants to be invested by you. So, so at the end of the day, with the venture client model, doing this approach of directly purchasing with a strategic objective, the technology of a startup, that is really the basis of the venture client model. I started to test this out in 2015, launching the BMW Startup Garage, and it turned out to work really, really great. We got access to really, really top startups. In a matter of weeks, we could close, a transfer, a contract, and the BMW engineers or anybody across the organization needed help from a startup, because ultimately that's what it is about. It's about getting help from startups, and they were extremely happy, because startups tend to solve the very complex problems, the problems you cannot solve as a corporate, which is why they get venture capital funded in the first place. Okay, so what I did, with this basic idea of let's do the purchase immediately and let's do this independent from investment, I created a unit. So a unit is a department, a venture client department, and that was very important, because just like in investment, you need a specific investment model when you invest in startups, you also need a specific model when you purchase and transfer a startup technology. So it's different processes and methods and resources you need to buy from IBM compared to a startup. Big difference. And that's really what I worked on in this venture client unit, which is an internal unit, also very important. That's not a external kind of plug-and-play kind of thing. It's really an internal competency of inside people who have a set of very specific resources and processes to make that transfer into the corporation really efficient. With the ultimate goal, well, actually two of those, is partnership, but also M&A. At the end of the day, we know that the M&A department purchases from the client. They purchase from the venture client. They go to the engineer and say, hey, you want to buy this startup? Tell me why you cannot build this technology yourself, correct? So convince me, but it's ultimately always this discussion between the M&A department and the client, who ultimately drives M&A. So the venture client unit turned out in the last, since I started this in 2015, over the last 7 years, turned out to be not just a way of purchasing or like innovating your supply chain. It also turned out to be very important for your M&A deal flow. And another interesting, don't want to go into the details of what the theory is behind or the steps. I'm happy to talk about this in later conversations with you. But one of the big things I think you're always thinking about is how to measure the strategic benefit through corporate venture capital. Now, with venture client, measuring the strategic benefit is possible, because at the end of the day, you have a problem. If you solve it, there's a business case behind it. You know that you reduce, the speed or improve the quality of a manufacturing process, or you bring out a product, speed up product innovation by a year or two. You can measure that. That's a real measurable benefit. And that's what a good venture client unit can do today, correct? They have also tools in which they basically look at each problem they want to solve via a startup, and once this problem is solved via a startup, you can start measuring that benefit. And if you measure benefits at just 1 million per startup per year, you bring in 50 startups per year, that's 50 million per year. And I tell you, this is many times much more than 1 million per year that you make money from using startup technology. So it adds up, correct? It compounds pretty quickly to beyond 50 million, maybe 100 million per year, with a very small budget in that sense, comparably, correct? There's no capital involved. The general metric is, with $1 million, you can run about 100 pilots, 75 to 150 pilots, and that's, 20 maybe 30 times more that you can do if you do this exclusively through investment. Okay, so here's a small video, 90-second video to explain the venture client model. As you can that's a video I did way back when at BMW, and it nicely explains how the model works, and see if the video works. Is it? It's not? Okay. You can find this video at bmwstartupgarage.com. Model works, not the video. That was because I was late. Okay. Good. Next one. This doesn't work either. Here's a video of a startup that was, maybe interesting, this picture. This is the typical not invented here syndrome dude. Right? Like when you say, oh, you have a not invented here. So there's a guy who worked 30 years at BMW, and he's like, he knows everything about driving dynamics. To the point where he's approached by the BMW startup garage, and they say, well, I've got a little piece of software that can do something to, to the car. And he's like, really? Let's have a look. And, with a few $1,000s, this guy was blown away. And now this technology from a startup called Mobileye, piece of software that basically measures what your wheels are doing on the street, which is quite important in autonomous driving. This technology is now added to every BMW car, probably soon to every other car. All right. So advantages of the model. You can identify and predict a problem that startups solve best. That's a very important part of the model. You can attract and validate top startups. I haven't found a startup who said no to a venture client unit. They generally answer your email in about 2 hours and want to do work with you. You can adopt those solutions fast and at low risk, and you can measure the competitive impact. And on top of that, now you are a client of the startup, and you probably have preferences in being, in joining the cap table and be able to invest. And we'll talk about this right now with Philipp from Robert Bosch Venture Capital and with Sulaiman from Siemens Energy. All right, so we've got about 20-25 minutes to exchange some experiences here with 2 other corporations who started using or started establishing a venture client unit, Bosch and Siemens. We're going to talk about really 3 topics. One is, why, first of all. Why did your corporation choose to add another vehicle of corporate venturing, and why this venture client model? What's the reasoning? What's the history behind? Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about how that worked. Some of the basics of how to integrate and set up such a unit. And thirdly, what are the synergies with investment? And so to my right here is Philipp. Over here is Aziz. Maybe you guys want to say a quick hello and give a quick background about yourself, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Okay, thanks, Gregor. Good morning. My name is Philipp Rose. I'm one of 2 managing directors of Robert Bosch Venture Capital. We are the corporate venture unit of the Bosch Group, which most of you probably know from dishwashers, power tools, or others. We are a corporate venture entity since 2008, investing globally. Just launched our 5th fund. It's a virtual fund, but still we invest out of funds, kind of. And we introduced the Open Bosch unit within RBVC, our acronym for Robert Bosch Venture Capital, some 4 years ago, with a lot of great support from Gregor and his team.
Hi, good morning. My name is Aziz. Can you hear me? Yeah? Good. My name is Aziz, and I'm quite lucky that I didn't put up my other two names also on the screen here because the confusion would have been perfect. So it's Aziz, Sulaiman, Rahim. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And we're quite new to the venturing space, not as Siemens, but as Siemens Energy. As Siemens Energy was basically formed about 2 years ago as part of a spin-out. And with that, we had basically the unique opportunity, and from a very personal point of view, also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really rethink and reshape how innovation and how venturing is done in a company of our size. And about 2 years ago, we basically found the Siemens Energy Ventures, where we have 3 tracks that we've built there. We do venture building, venture capital, and venture clienting. And while as venture building and venture capital obviously are aiming more towards the mid to long-term goals of our company and what our growth aspirations are really concerned, the venture clienting model for us really is a means to create fast traction, but also involve a lot more colleagues in the organization, because as you can imagine, we're an engineering company. We are keen to learn new things, to get exposed to new solutions, and at the same time, enabling technologies and improving our processes. These are things that we, from a venture building or venture capital point of view, not would put too much focus on, and this is exactly where the venture clienting unit basically drives a lot of the progress in what we do within our innovation framework, basically.
Thanks, Aziz. So, Philipp, you mentioned that Bosch started its venture client journey 4 years ago. To my account, I think it was the second company after BMW, so pioneers like always, Bosch. And actually learned about the venture client model before it started 27 Pilot. So this was not a, so this was independent from, and so maybe Philipp, what happened in the background? You know, how did you guys come up with venture clienting before there was even, you know, a service offering, before it was even maybe written in, you know, in some papers, and before it was really known? You know, how did that come about at Bosch?
Yeah. So maybe I start really at the beginning. First of all, when Bosch set up the venture unit, it was more the focus, we need to look what is out there in the startup world. Bosch was very much inward focused, not invented here, big thing. And so the then CEO said, no, we need to know more what's happening in the startup scene. So, and the management fortunately immediately understood, in order to have this transparency and access, we also need to invest. So right from the beginning, we did direct investments, some fund investments, and with this, we got access to the startups, to co-founder, to co-investors, and the entire ecosystem. And then pretty soon, a couple of years later, when we had quite decent deal flow, we were saying, well, there's so much relevant deal flow that we have, and we only invest in 5 to 10 a year. There should be more for Bosch out of this really relevant deal flow. And we started funding and sponsoring accelerator programs, and with dedicated topics for Bosch. Bosch Power Tools, for example, laid some base technology into this accelerator program with the aim of startups developing, inventing some new applications around that. And that worked quite well in certain cases, but not throughout, not long-term, not sustainably. So we were challenged again by the CEO and said, you have more than 2,000 startups every year that you see. Why is there not more of a collaboration? So we went out and did a kind of a benchmark, what other corporates do. And through that, we, among others, came across BMW iVentures and BMW Startup Garage, and looked into that in more detail, had interviews with you guys, and we said, this is really the model for us, for our purposes. It may not fit others, but for us, it really fitted very well, and we kind of adopted it to our purposes and means, and tried it, and we said, and convinced management, let's do it for 3 years, and let's see how far we can get within 3 years, and that's where it started.
Okay. So no venture client unit was closed during COVID. You know, maybe I know that's also a sign that this actually works. Aziz, how did it work at Siemens Energy? So Siemens Energy is a new company spun out of the Siemens AG conglomerate, became its own public entity, and your CTO, Vinos, started this whole innovation, let's say, infrastructure, and you and your colleague Kendra also thought about models. How did you stumble upon the venture client model, and what made you decide to add this to your mix of tools?
So at the very beginning, that was pretty clear that we would need to build two tracks, which is, one is internally focused, where we really help our colleagues to develop new business models, technologies, and with that, businesses. And the other one would be outside-oriented, where we work with startups. And in here, obviously, the question was, what will be a suitable, helpful tool? And while we were always working with startups as Siemens, and then, as you can imagine, within the Siemens universe, pretty much every innovation tool that anybody has ever written a paper on was present. Yeah. And we had obviously the luck of being aware of those tools, knowing the strengths, the weaknesses, having experimented with those. And with that, one of the pain points we really identified for ourselves was that we've been continuously piloting with startups, but it never really became a running engine or a running machine that would really also lead to the benefits that we were hoping for, whether it's an M&A, an investment, or long-term partnerships. And with that, like Bosch, obviously, this is probably a corporate instinct. We did a benchmarking. And in that process, we ended up also talking with some colleagues from Bosch Open Innovation, but also stumbled upon this expression of venture clienting, because what we've been basically doing and what we've been trying to build up was nicely framed and then described in the venture clienting model. And so this was very clear for us that while the venture capital conversations will take some time, because we needed to really also get the board buy-in on the objectives, the thesis, and then what sort of outlook we want to prepare for that. It was really about, okay, what are the things that we can already do today? And then what are the things that can already showcase what the power of startups could be for Siemens? And it was also not hard to convince, obviously, the management, because, I mean, we're among peers here, so I can name it, but the call is always for, let's do something with startups. And we were then basically able to show them like a viable way forward on creating visible impact on the short term that would then obviously also create the way forward for any M&A, but also venture capital activities there.
Okay. Yeah, I want to share two metrics from BMW. When obviously BMW has been working and buying startup technology since the 90s. BMW opened its first office in Silicon Valley in 98 or 96. But what I measured in 2015 in an academic research was that it took BMW 2.5 years to issue a first purchase order to a startup. So if you want to use the technology, you got to buy it, correct? If not, it's useless. So, but even a purchase order that may be small, you know, way below whatever 5,000 or 100,000, 2.5 years of, and with the venture client model, we reduced it to under 3 months. We also increased the amount of technology. So I also looked into how many startups was BMW engaging with without this venture client unit and compared to with, and it increased by a factor of 10. So we're looking at a few really handful of startups per year that made their way through purchasing and basically through that to the user. And now, you know, this suddenly exploded in numbers across the company. Now let's talk, and you already touched on that a little bit, Aziz. How painful is it to set up a venture client unit? And maybe to be concrete, like, do you have to set up a new company, or do you have to, you know, go through a lot of legals and, you know, tax, and, you know, what are the kind of structural, and how fast do you get really operational so that you can start, you know, harnessing some results?
Mm-hmm. I think in times when you get into the process, it can be hard because it's really also a matter of change management. And with that, we adapt our processes, we adapt the ways of how we basically bring these things forward. But to really get started, this was rather a straightforward task. So we knew what the objectives were, we knew what we wanted to achieve. And while we were basically staffing the team and then really also setting up the core areas where we wanted to experiment in. Selecting a partner like 27 Pilots definitely helped us a lot to just, get the team already operational, because a lot of the learnings that was applied basically from the industries that, we're doing it already, and then getting together, and what the 27 Pilots model also basically stands for. So in that regard, I think it was rather straightforward, because, there was a simple handbook that we could use. And in parallel, and I think this is obviously the change management part, really getting the colleagues from across the company on board that become allies, collaborators, also our internal customers as the venture clienting unit. This is obviously something that takes a little bit of time. So within the first few weeks, we have identified the first 2 pilots. Within the first 6 months, we've basically kicked off 6 different pilots, concluded 2, went into adoption conversations for 1 already. So that was rather quick traction for a corporate of our size. But obviously what we're now facing in order to really establish the model across the company is we need to train and develop further associates across the company that are really within the businesses, that own the problems, that also have the depth for identifying the high priority topics basically. So this is obviously a very, very interesting, nice, but also a timely process sometimes. And we are adding to our procurement guidelines right now. So we are creating an island process for pilots, for startups, that basically comes with reduced asks that we would typically have for our suppliers when it comes to the terms and conditions. So typically we like to pay late when we procure from big other corporates. In some cases, with some of our startup partners, that would have basically led to insolvency pretty much during the pilot phase, I think including the pilot at some point probably. So with that, we've adapted also that. So in that regard, that kind of gets the whole organization now moving, and with that, the map of stakeholders, collaborators, and allies is increasingly also growing, which then helps again to establish it as a model that can work, and that is basically a go-to tool if we really want to, produce visible, tangible, impactful results there.
Yeah, maybe to add. So for us, first of all, it was, as I mentioned, it was a project, a test case. Let's see how far we can get in the first 3 years. I think what was important is that we had clear goals for these 3 years. Where do we want to be after 3 years? In terms of numbers of collaboration projects, but also by other means. And the difficult part indeed was to convince the organization about standard PO, establishing each startup as a supplier within weeks, and having IP also sorted, plus a couple of other things. So that took a while, and there was quite some pushback from the organization at the beginning. But we got there. We have a very standardized process now. It is one kind of contract, if you want, and if either side doesn't accept it, we don't do the project. We don't start any negotiations. It is either this or nothing. That helps. The other, I think, very important thing is top management support. And we always said that to the management, and fortunately they stick to it. From the very first year, we handed out the Open Bosch Award, so to celebrate the 2 best cooperations between startups and Bosch teams. And really the award goes to both sides, also the Bosch team, not only the startup, which is very important to overcome this cultural change or mindset change that really is very broad in the organization. And we have, whenever there are successful projects, we celebrate it, we communicate about it, and so start with the low-hanging fruits, and then from there do more and more to convince also others that are hesitant in the first place. And we have now we have a dedicated team within RBBC of 3 people who are coordinating the whole exercise, but into the organization. It's not a organization, but it's a loose network. But in more and more business entities, they've bought into the idea and they said, okay, we do commit certain capacities, and there are venture managers, we call it, that coordinate projects within the business unit with the startups. And with this loose network, this really gathers momentum. And the more people hear about it, also over time, but it does take time, more and more also get excited.
Yeah. Think of it like the Scrum Master, now you have the Venture Client Master across the organization. And what I saw at BMW is once those people start working with the startups, they see this incredible expertise of those founders. They see how fast they are and how eager they are to help you solve their problems. And that's really also one of the things that gets, that lowers the barriers and the acceptance and increases the pull. So as the network grows, really the demand for startup also grows. Maybe a few words, Philipp, now that you've done it for 4 years within the settings of a corporate venture capital unit, what are the synergies to invest in?
First of all, it still starts with our deal flow that we have. The 2,500 or so startups, new startups every year that we log in our system, we realize that they are more relevant for Open Bosch, for the venture client team, when they look for solutions for problems that need to be solved by business units. Because there is a kind of a pre-selection already by the investment colleagues, and they only log those that really are relevant. And so we see that indeed the deal flow is more, there's a higher chance that you can find a suitable startup within that deal flow than if the Open Bosch team goes out and searches kind of randomly and through databases, whatever. Okay. And the second one I also want to mention, it also helps us, the investment team, in the reputation within the group. Because whenever we have more high-level discussions with the business entities, when we talk about search areas and trends and where's the market going and so, and when we can show this impact that our group actually has for the business unit. Listen, last year we enabled for you 8 POCs and 3 partnerships came out of that. That really also heightens the overall acceptance of RBBC. So it also helps for the fun part, i.e. the investment side.
Okay. So we'll talk later about what the non-acceptance issues were before that. But yeah, I hear, what I heard at BMW here and there is like when they're approached by the investors, many times it's a little bit perceived like, well, I'm helping them with making an investment as opposed to do they help me solving a problem. The thing is, you combine venture client with venture capital, you can really brand your startup value proposition to the corporation, and I'm helping you with solving your problems, and on top of that, we're also benefiting financially. Aziz, 2 words about financial synergies. You don't have as many years experience as Robert Bosch here, and then we'll jump into questions from the audience. 2 minutes or 2 questions? 2 sentences?
I'll maybe emphasize 2 particular synergies that are really helpful right now. So one is that on our venture building track, we're constantly developing, obviously, ideas and business models. And when it comes to really also bringing those to life, this is, and because we always go with the problem first. So in most of the cases, we don't propose a startup to the business for piloting and then try to sell it to them. Most of the cases is really about trying to understand what problem we're trying to solve, and then based on that, we do the global scouting. And then obviously also with from the deal flow. But the venture building teams are usually always getting to a point where they say, well, we've validated it, it's working, we want to do it, but either we lack the time, the resources, the expertise, and then the venture clienting model actually comes very handy. And another thing that we have also established as a guiding principle for our deal book process really is that before initiating any conversation on M&A with a startup or of a startup, we want to see a pilot. Because there's one thing to do a due diligence on a startup when you ask questions, but the other thing is really to get to know the founders in action, to get to see the technology, the solution at a much deeper basis together with the experts, and then really also de-risking any sort of investment conversation through that. And I think these are probably the most straightforward synergies that we're currently seeing.
Thank you. Do we have time for a question?
1 minute.
1 minute? Is there a 1 minute question?
Well, 10-second question, 50 seconds answer.
Okay.
So if a short answer is required, I'll leave it to you, Philipp.
Okay.
This one.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was very enlightening. My name is Jasdeep Soni. I'm Woven Planet Holdings and Woven Capital, the investment arm of Woven Planet. For those of you who don't know, Woven Planet is a new software and services company for Toyota Motor Corporation. And our investment thesis goes beyond mobility as well, so a smart city context. I found this model very interesting, the venture client model. A bit of context. In my past life, I was the head of new mobility investments at Renault Nissan Mitsubishi's CVC, Alliance Ventures. And we set up a unit, a venture client unit, independent of the investment or M&A activity, so to really bring in startups and create synergies between the core business and functions inside Renault Nissan Mitsubishi, manufacturing, sales, purchasing, all kinds of various functions. And the challenge that we had in that was to go deep inside these functions. So, half of 500,000 employees versus a 20-person startup, right? So how do you find the right function deep inside this organization across manufacturing, R&D, various different functions? And then how do you get employees in those functions to actually start working with the startup and believe that there is a gain to be had working with those startups and getting past the not invented here syndrome, and also asking them to allocate resources, right? Time, money, etc., to work with the startup and do pilots, etc. So my question is two things. First of all, what is, in terms of, say, BMW, for example, iVentures and BMW as an organization, what was the makeup of the venture client unit team? Was it employees from those functions inside BMW in various different parts of BMW and coming out and allocating part of their time to work with startups? Or did you recruit people from the outside who had more experience in this area? And the second question is, how do you get past this not invented here syndrome? And how long did it take to get over that hump to get these functions to work with the startups and actually create business with those startups? A lot of times we also found that those functions were scared to share any information about what they're working on because they thought the startup might steal IP, etc.
That was a good 10-second question.
Okay, I have a 10-second answer. Shall I?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, team, it's important to have insiders, people who know the corporation and people who have a good relationship with the corporation. It's not something that you can do from the outside. And ideally, it's a person or people that also have strong top management backing. And the not invented here syndrome, think about the following problem. You want to charge the battery in 3 minutes to a 1,000-kilometer range. Startup knocks on the door. 150 million Series A funding. Who's going to say no to that? So you got to find the painful problems, and for the really painful problems, definitely the acceptance goes down, and that's in the nature of startups, because startups tend to solve the very complex things, and the main challenge of the venture client unit is to find those complex challenges within the corporation that nobody's really able to solve, and show that startups have a relevant solution for that. And here's where the not invented here syndrome will draw.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Aziz. Thanks, Philipp.
Thank you.
Thanks, James and team.